spend a good bit of time later talking about some of these specific hormones later in the term. Dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, we'll talk about a lot because they're very, especially epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine especially, is the neurotransmitter of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And we will always talk about nervous system and hormonal regulation of particular processes in the body. And if we're talking about nervous system regulation, we're looking at autonomic nervous system regulation, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we will have to talk about characteristic neurotransmitters of those pathways, and we'll do that actually on Wednesday next week. And then the hormonal regulation will depend, what the hormone is, will depend upon what system is regulated. There are unique hormones that regulate unique systems instead of just a general, autonomic nervous system. Don't worry about that. All right, now, the endocrine reflex pathway is really the homeostatic reflex pathway, right? You have a stimulus. You got to respond to the stimulus, right? You have to have some afferent signal that you have to integrate and then give a response. And that response is directed toward targets. Now here the response is the production and release of the hormone that goes to the target. Almost all of these are negative feedback. Positive feedback doesn't really work in regulating homeostasis because it's always more, less. This negative feedback is what's going to do it. So for example, if blood calcium levels are too low, we release PTH, break down bone, absorb calcium, blood calcium levels go back up. Right? So that hormone is going to help us regulate this. Oftentimes it's in conjunction with nervous system regulation. They often work simultaneously. Sometimes there is only nervous system regulation. Sometimes there's only endocrine regulation, but the majority of the time it's a dual regulation, both via endocrine and nervous system regulation. This just shows a kind of just a cartoon response. Again, we'll see some very specific examples throughout the term. Low blood calcium, PTH, goes to the bone and the kidney, break down bone, reabsorb calcium, blood calcium levels go up. Negative feedback. Do you think there's an antagonistic hormone to parathyroid hormone, meaning that would do the opposite? Yeah, there should be, right? Because sometimes blood calcium levels will be high. Right? And there is, and it's called calcitonin. And it's synthesized from vitamin D. This just shows another example here. What is it, insulin? I can't read it. Again, specific examples, I don't really care, but sometimes it's we have to have a stimulus that triggers the response. Sometimes it's a single stimulus, like low blood calcium, to trigger the response. Oftentimes, it can be multiple stimuli to get the same response. And that, again, should kind of make sense because if something is very critical, like blood sugar regulation, you shouldn't depend upon a single pathway to regulate that, right? You should have multiple measures to look at to see, is this out of balance or whatever. So oftentimes, multiple stimuli, like these three right here, can elicit the same response. Okay? And again, like I said, that should be logical for some things. If it's incredibly important, don't rely on one way to get that information. Have multiple ways to get that information. And this is just multiple ways you can get that information. Now, as far as the overall control of the endocrine system, we used to say, and people still say it, that the pituitary gland is the master gland. Right? You may have heard that. That's not true. The reason people call the pituitary gland the master gland is because there's a category of hormones that are called trophic hormones, and they regulate the secretion of other hormones. So they regulate endocrine glands. Their targets are endocrine glands. With only a couple exceptions, all of the hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland are trophic hormones, meaning they regulate my endocrine glands in my body. That's true. So that's why it's called the master gland. But it became increasingly clear that the pituitary gland didn't do anything on its own. It is always instructed to release those trophic hormones by the hypothalamus. So what really controls the endocrine system? Your hypothalamus. how does it do it? It secretes hormones that regulate the pituitary gland. And if you remember from anatomy, there is a portal circuit right there. There is a direct venous connection from, and they're real close to each other, from the hypothalamus into the, what did we call it? We call it the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal circuit. It's a mouthful, right? But it just goes between the hypothalamus and the hypophysis, which is the technical name for the pituitary gland. So capillaries absorb hypothalamic hormones. They go directly to the pituitary, where they influence the hypophysis, the pituitary gland's secretions. So this trophic regulation, right, is very common there.